Good day to everyone. So, welcome to Awesome Maps presentation about Introduction to Openness and Open Data and FOSS. So, here's the outline of this talk or of this presentation as well. I'm going to go through various definitions about data, open data, freedom, and FOSS, and what can we do to contribute, and as well as use these types of software and applications. I'm going to go through a series of definitions, and first one is data. So as you can see in this slide, data is a factual information and used as a basis for reasoning, discussion, or calculation. So we can think of data as a driver of information, driver of knowledge. And it can be an information in digital form that can be transmitted or processed. So right now in this digital age or digital information field, right, wherein there's a lot of telemetry, a lot of tracking from which websites that you go through and so on, and you'll notice that Google knows, okay, you've selected a certain game or a certain type of clothing, and it provides you these types of recommendations that tend to be like following you everywhere, right? And in data is also information output by a sensing device. So if you're going to think about it, this is like your satellite, right? Wherein it captures an image over an area, or let's say your medical devices, let's say X-rays, MRI scans, and so on. So the good thing about these sensors is it also captures irrelevant or redundant information. It's also a good thing, not only a bad thing or a con, because it provides you context about the information that you're gathering. It's not only focused on the target information or target sensor that it usually gets. So when we use data, there's a lot of uses if you're going to think about how data is being used in today's world, right? It can be for information decision making, informed decision making, problem solving, improved processes, greater understanding behavior. But we should be very careful about how we use data because it can also drive or misinformation, or it can also lead to biases. So if you're going to see here, this is a typical diagram in the data science community wherein you're going to have a lot of bullet holes of this, let's say, this airplane, right? Wherein it calculated a lot of these bullets were shot in these areas. And you can also see that there are no bullet holes in the engine. So if you're going to think about it, your the first guess about these type of data is that you may want to reinforce the airplane on the bullet holes, but it tells you another story is that these are the airplanes that returned, right? These are the machines that came back, or these are the successful airplanes that were returned to the base. And majority of the airplanes that did not return would have holes in those engines. So you may want to look at it on that perspective that data can be misleading, it can be misinformed, it can drive wrong decisions. That's why when you think about data, you need also to think about the context where that data is coming from. So when we now I go on to the next set of definition of openness, right? So in the typical sense that open is having no enclosing or confining barrier or accessible on all nearly all sides. So basically you can get uh, the information or even the thing inside an open environment, right? It's completely free from concealment, exposed to general knowledge or view. So as I mentioned earlier about data is that okay, it tells you also irrelevant information. And if you're into this open world or open mentality, is that the thing that you're going to look at can be exposed. You can query it, you can inquire about it, you can ask questions about it, and so on. And sometimes the bad thing about being open is that it's vulnerable to attack or question. And sometimes in organizations who have something that's very they're trying to conceal their information or their, let's say, trade secrets, they tend to frown upon this idea of openness. So when we combine open and data, there's what we call the open data. Open means anyone can freely access, use, modify, and share for any purpose, subject at most to requirements that preserve provenance and openness. So, and open data and content can be freely used, modified, shared by anyone for any purpose. So and it's written in the opendefinition.org. So something to think about as well is that when we combine open and data, a lot of even government is going to be a very hard time. They don't really push for open data per se because if we're going to go back to the original definition of open, is that you're free to question about what is being released or the information that is being released, right? And sometimes people don't want to be questioned. They are in this position of, okay, I'm in power, anything you don't have any power over me, so therefore you should follow what I'm saying, right? It's like gatekeeping. It's like they're telling you that you should not question what I'm saying. So similarly in this talk, right? I'm going to give you a lot of information, and we're going to have this question and answer portion later, wherein that is your right, that is your ability to question what I'm presenting right now. So if you have any questions about the things that I'm talking about, you're free to do that. And open data encourages that. And it also provides you this flexibility of using that data to other purposes, because if you're especially in government data, you're paying for it directly or indirectly. You're paying it through VAT. You're paying it through your some of us here, let's say paying, let's say, income tax returns and so on. You're paying for that, so you're partly owning of that data. It's not actually government who owns that data, but everyone in this room or call is have that ownership per se. So yeah, open data can push for other uses, and you're free to use whatever you want to do with data. If you want to make $1 billion or a billion pesos out of that open data, you can do that as well. And this is also in conjunction to freedom, right? So if we're going to go back to the definition of open data in the previous slide, is that you're open to use it, and you're free to modify and use that data to other purposes. So this is where freedom comes in, right? So freedom is the absence of necessity, coercion, or constraint in choice or action, and the typical definition is unrestricted use. So when we think about freedom in the context of data and the context of being open data and open source, is that again you're free to use how you want to use it. The technology itself is amoral, and we're now in this environment wherein we are asking technology to be more safe. We're asking technology to be more constrained, because we are now having this discussion about, okay, whether machine learning or artificial intelligence will endanger a lot of jobs and so on. But if we're going to go back and have a step back, the technology itself is not actually the problem. The problem comes or arises on how we use the technology. If you're going to think about it, let's say the road, right? If a person establishes a road network from, let's say, point A to point B, the road doesn't care whether a criminal crosses that road. Whether that road will be helpful to establish the economy of that place, right? It doesn't have that moral ascendancy or moral question. So when we think about freedom in the context of data and open source or application or software, is that it is an amoral thing, and how we use it comes is now the question whether we want to put more restrictions to it, but not the technology itself. It should never be used in that space. And when we now go into this, what we call the freedom in the context of free and open source software, is that we have what we call the four freedoms. Is that the freedom to run the program as you wish for any purpose. Again, I go back to the road scenario, right? Wherein you can use the road to transport, let's say, economic value, or you want to transport a person who is dying to a hospital, for example, or you can use it to, I don't know, do other things that are, let's say, illegal or criminal in that case, right? So you're also free. Freedom number one is that to study how the program works and change it. So does your computing as you wish. So this is in the context of the open in the software, right? So because a lot of us here, when we install something in, let's say, Microsoft or Windows, right, you have this exe file. The question is, how sure are you that exe file doesn't have any viruses, right? How sure? You're just going to trust. You're just going to download something from the internet and so on. This is where the malware comes in, the viruses comes in, that it executes something behind the scenes and so on. So when you're talking about open source or free and open source software, is that the code is available. You can inquire about it. So this is where a lot of advocates in the open source community are pushing for, let's say, Philippine elections to be in the software that we're going to use should be open, right? It should be open source because it tells you that this application doesn't have any unscrupulous calculation or computation, right? You're seeing how the computer runs or how that machine runs. And some may argue that, okay, what about security? What about those information that gatekeeps, or what about the how should you say, the transportation of that information from one place to another, right? If I know the software or source code, I know how to penetrate it, how I know how to break it, right? But something that comes into play there as well is that the software itself is not only, you're only looking at the computation, the code. How the software is set up in the context of that ecosystem of that, let's say, use is can be closed, right? So for example, you're responsible, or the security of that system, you may want to add more guards to it. Similar to the road network, road analogy that I'm saying earlier, is that, okay, if you want to prevent actors or, let's say, criminals from crossing that road, why not put more policemen to it? Similarly, in the open source, the road is open, but you have people who are watching, who are monitoring that road, right? So we can put more security in that context. Is that when you run the application, you ensure that, okay, you put in your firewalls, you put in your antivirus software and so on. So we can put that in. And so that's how you do this. So what we call freedom number one. Freedom number two is that you're free to redistribute copies so you can help your neighbor. So again, we go back to the question of how you want to use open source software or open data. Is that you're free to use it, right? And you're free to distribute it. And you're going to see a lot of end user license agreement, right? When you open, let's say, when you install software, you need to read through this terms of service or terms of agreement, wherein there is a restriction or clause wherein you are restricted from distributing it or giving it to another person. And it's now this freedom number two is conjunction with freedom number three, is that you're free to distribute the copies of your modified versions. So what does this mean, right? Is that when you modify the software, you're free to change you're free to distribute what you change for it, right? So if you, let's say, for that software you made a lot of changes, you're free to give it to another person, because that is one of the freedoms, and you are able to make more money out of it, right? So if, because you added your own intellectual property or special sauce for it. So it it not only it gives you this wherein the software is being distributed, but also you're improving the changes, you're improving the ecosystem, because you are adding new functionalities to the software, you're adding new functionalities or applications, let's say, to the data that is being used. You can think of other applications, and it enriches that ecosystem. So going back again, this is in conjunction. So this is a definition: free and open source software. So it just reinforces the four freedoms that FOSS advocates, and it provides these types of principles, right? So again, refers to something people can modify, share because it's designed publicly accessible. projects, products, or initiatives embrace and celebrate principles of open knowledge, collaborative participation, prototyping, transparency, meritocracy, and community. So software with source code that anyone can inspect, modify, and enhance. So if you're going to think about it, it's like a Lego set setting wherein you are free to change the colors of this Lego. So for example, you don't want this multicolored Lego, you want everything blue or everything green. You're free to do that. So that is what FOSS is that you're not bowing to the master of, let's say, who created the software. It's basically you are able to, okay, if the software doesn't work or if the software doesn't conform to the standards that I'm setting, I can change it, right? You don't need to go back to the end user or to the developer, okay, please change this. You're free to do it. So open and free, free in this case is free in freedom. It's not just about free stuff, right? Again, if we go back to the four principles of the four freedoms, it's not just about free stuff wherein you're free to distribute these types of software or systems to other people, but it also encourages you to modify it and give it. And free also decentralizes power. So if you're going to think about it, before, if it's a closed source software, let's say Microsoft, right? You have a system, you have a software and you found, okay, what if my PowerPoint should just be very small, or I don't need all of these functionalities, I don't want all of this telemetry, all of this tracking in PowerPoint. What if I can move that, right? So right now you need to communicate that to Microsoft, and Microsoft is the one who will decide whether they will accept your request or not. So it centralizes power, right, in that regard. So in a free and open source software type of system, since the code is open, since the system is open, you can modify it, and you don't need to go back to Microsoft, and Microsoft will tell you, okay, you should not modify that software, or you cannot modify it, because you have the power now to modify that software. And a lot of people have this notion wherein, okay, since it's centralized, or there's one person, I can modify or I can inquire about it, then you'll have it's easier for them. But sometimes I've been there in enterprise environments. They're receiving millions of bugs every day for the software that they use. And usually Microsoft only have, let's say, a certain amount of engineers that is allocated to it. So there's minimal chance that your stuff or your bug or issue will be resolved, because again, you have now a restriction of power or that resource constraint. And it also provides you this decentralized notion wherein, since everyone has that power or has that software, they can build their own thing, right? They're not very dependent, they're not be dependent on one person or one organization. And also, it's also the great equalizer. So there is a saying, right? If you're building software, or when you're building this application or this data, it's a great equalizer. Any kid, there's a saying wherein any kid in a garage can put out of business the big corporations, because you have that power to change the software that you're using, to change or to use the open data, the data that is gathered, and use $1 million or $1 billion out of it. So it provides you that. So it not only that you have this free, it's not just about free stuff, it's about decentralizing the power, again, removing those dependency, and it provides you this great equalizer that anyone can change the world as long as they have these types of systems. So what now, right? What can we do with open data and free and open source software? So these are the things that you can do and build on this the notion of FOSS and open data. Is that if you're going to look at on the left hand side, there is the Blender application. So this is an open source rendering 3D rendering application wherein you can build 3D assets, right? You don't need $1 million to buy that application, right? So for example, I don't know how much Adobe Cloud now. I think Adobe Cloud is about $200 a month. So it's very expensive, right? It's very expensive. So if you're not into this piracy notion, then then you cannot build, let's say, a game. You cannot build a movie, because you are you need to have those tools for you to develop. So using open source software and systems, you can develop those movies, right? You can develop your own short story. You're not dependent on the tool. You just need to have the idea. You need to have this creative storyline or story to present it to the audience. So you have this blender, and there is a person who developed or 3D printed the Mayon volcano. So this is a DEM. So this DEM is an open data. So you can download the data of a what we call a digital elevation model. So we're in for every surface, you can identify, okay, the elevation of that point, or that surface. And he used what we call GDAL and HMM, which are open source software, wherein he used the data to render these types of model. So another application or of use is the what we call the various um, mapping hubs, wherein, for example, in the hot OSM on the upper right hand corner, is that there's a I believe there's a what we call an emergency response. We're in Turkey and Syria earthquake response, and we're in people helped to map the areas, because one thing about that location is that a lot of buildings were destroyed, a lot of road networks were blocked. So you need to have volunteers who will look at the data, who will look at the satellite imagery and identify which areas were badly hit, which areas can be accessed by a certain road network, and so on. And you cannot do that with closed source software or closed source data. So, for example, if government has that data, right, go- and the only people in the world have that data would be the government of Turkey or Syria, the emergency response will be very slow, because people or those emergency organizations would need to request data from those government agencies, and that government agency or those the government of Turkey or Syria would have their hands full. They're already coordinating response, and they're also trying to move those emergency response teams. So what this aims to decentralize that effort, wherein, since I already have the data, I can move my assets quite freely. I can move my assets quite fast, or in an expeditious manner or efficient manner, because I already have that power. I already have that data to assess, to provide information, to move my resources around. And again, we go back to the decentralization power, or decentralization use case, wherein you have this case, right? And you also have this what we call the Project NOAA, so of UP before, and the OST, UST and UP, wherein they're able to communicate disaster or emergency awareness, and people would be able to translate those information into actionable insights on the ground, right? So because if people on the ground would need to request to the main government agency, let's say DO, FIVOX, PAG-ASA, and those types of organizations, it will also take time, because and a lot of those agencies are focused on other things. They're not focused on just distributing data or just managing the data, right? So another thing is that you not only about serious applications, you can also build it for aesthetics. So for example, you can build socks about open data and so on. And you also have what we call a cake here from OpenStreetMap. So this is something cool about open data and open source software, is that you can also build autonomous vehicles for it. So so if you're going to look at it, so everything is now in GitHub. So this is similar to the Tesla full self-driving car, so FSD, right? This is open pilot. So if you're going to notice on this presentation or in this video, is that the hands of the driver is on his lap, and the car is just driving by itself, right? So you have a map here, and you have, let's say, a camera, a vision, and other sensors. And there's also a camera that is directed to the driver to pinpoint if the driver is looking at it or if the driver is falling asleep or so on. So this technology or this open pilot system is is trained on the is built on open source software, and the code is open, right? And the data that they're used to train are also being uploaded by the users of this application or of this system, wherein people are free to upload the data that they used or the driving data that they have, and the model itself will be trained on that. And as you can see here, it now supports with 200 plus car models like Toyota, Hyundai, Honda, and many other brands. So if you're going to think about it, let's say full self-driving car of Tesla, it only works for Tesla. If the full self-driving car would work on the other brands, most likely not, and Tesla would most likely license it. And the good thing about this one is that it tells you what data it was trained on, which software it was used, what are the things that are being let's say recorded, or and so on. Because you don't know that if you have this specific self-driving car. So as you can see here, there are turns and so on. It's not just a straight path. So this is the beauty of, let's say, you having this ecosystem or those of this environment where people can upload data, can work on this open source software. You can build cool things like this, and um, you don't need to be at the scale of Tesla to build something like this. The person or the company who built this or of this is that they are, let's say, I believe they're not close to 100 people. I think around 50 and so on. So it's a small company, but they are a very good, and they're using the community to build that ecosystem of, let's say, awareness and open source software. Okay. So what now? And not only open source and open data encourages those types of application, it also prevents what we call vendor lock-in. So if you're going to go back, I think a few years ago, wherein LTO had a problem with a certain IT provider that, okay, the database, they cannot get the data, or it's locked in and so on. Imagine if the data is, or even if the technology that they're using is open source, right? Wherein they don't have this what we call vendor lock-in. The system or the data that is being stored or can be readily be accessible to them and be applied to new technologies. So it also tells us that your the government or anyone will not be hostage by the main developer of that, because they can use that data and it's following, let's say, open standards, and you can use that to another system, right? And you're not locked into it or chained to it. So now the question is, what can you do to contribute, right? So one way to contribute is what we call this OpenStreetMap initiative, wherein a lot of buildings, a lot of footprints in the Philippines, especially on the countryside, wherein it still lacks assets, it still lacks the facilities or the areas wherein you can put, let's say, spatial information, right? And OpenStreetMap allows you to do that. You can be a contributor to it. So for you to contribute, there's the account here, and of course in the slides. So, and also you can also be just a user, right? Again, the main purpose of software and data is just use them. So if I'm going to go back to the Adobe product, there's a lot of alternatives to the Adobe products. You may be thinking, there's a lot of features and functionalities that I use already in this in those software, right? But something to note, there's a lot of functionalities in those software are not being used by you anyway, right? So you can also look at it in the context of, you have all of these alternatives, they're all $0, if you're going to think about it. The only time or the only investment that you need to make in this technology or in this spectrum is that you need to spend time using it, be proficient about it, and so on. So do you have any questions for me for this? So I'll now switch to the video call.